crises don't create social trends, they accelerate them.
Hey, you're watching The Intersection, where faith, life, and culture meet. I'm Justin May.
And I'm Eric Targe. We are so glad to have you with us today. Again.
Yeah. Again. It's, man, you're back.
Yes,
nice.
Second episode of 2021.
Unless it's your first one with us.
Yeah.
At which point the other one was good too.
Yeah, you should check out that one. It was a phenomenal interview with Rico Tice a little while ago on evangelism. But today, we're actually going to kind of switch tones, if you will.
Yeah.
Right? We're going to be kind of approaching this from a different angle. And so we want to warn those who might be triggered by this episode.
So I think everybody is aware there's just rising stats all over the place about the suicide rate, not just locally or anything, but internationally. And especially among young people, the demographics that you and I
both work in college ministry and
high school have to deal with. And so we thought this was an important topic, and we wanted to try and bring some helpful information and just thinking into it. And so
we're just so blessed that we're going to be having someone with us who's given us their time, who really is an expert in this field in regards to really how we come alongside of those who are suffering, those who are struggling with depression, severe anxiety, or other mental health diagnoses in the church.
Yes, we are so thrilled to have Brad Hambrick with us. He is he's a couple of things. He's assistant professor of biblical counseling at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he also is pastor of counseling at the Summit Church in Durham, North Carolina. We are just so grateful to have him here. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks for being with us.
It's my pleasure. I'm grateful to be here.
Now, Brad, you are Dr. Hambrick, right?
Yes, I have completed the appropriate academic rituals and written dissertation to be a doctor.
But you can't write us a prescription.
I cannot. So I am not a psychiatrist. I am not a licensed mental health professional.
So you're not anti-psychologist, anti-psychiatrist. You're not like working against them.
Nope. My focus in what I do in ministry-based care is equipping people within the church, consulting with our pastoral team, so that via those types of relationships that we do as good a job as we can to care for folks in the midst of hard times. Whenever you talk on a subject like this, sometimes it's easy for people to get confused and go, okay, does that, we're going to move into some subjects where being clinically informed and theologically accurate is important. And so hopefully people hear a good blend of both.
That's awesome. So this is kind of a heavy topic, right? And there's a lot to unpack here, but I want to ask sort of just the really broad, just the big dummy question, which is why do people take their own lives?
Yeah.
And whenever we get to a big question like that, that we're not even quite sure how to ask, oftentimes it just feels like, man, there's some categories here that I'm not quite able to put into words. And so as I think about this question, I think it may be most helpful just to consider, how is it that many of us just intuitively walk into a question like this? I think the place many of us starts, which is think, man, if somebody's considering taking their own life, it has to be because, life is hard and things are bad. Because it seems somewhat obvious that if things are good and easy, we don't tend to think about harming ourselves during those times. But, for most of us, we go through hard times. And so just saying, hey, when things are hard and things are bad, that doesn't seem like it differentiates things enough. Because, man, if we look and just said, hey, anytime life is hard and things are bad, I mean, we're in the middle of COVID. That's true for everybody right now. We would be at risk all of the time. And so when we move kind of past the hard and bad criteria, if I could pick a couple of things that tend to be more the telltale factors that in the midst of all of the complexity that we just mentioned, um, usually people get to that point of considering taking their own life when they lose hope. So it's not that things are bad, it's that they've lost a sense that things will ever get better. They've resigned themselves that it's not going to change. Um, Another factor that can often be there that may just be a different verse of the same song is when somebody has an overpowering secret. Something about themselves, something they've done, something other people don't know, and they just live haunted that I'm never going to be able to be fully known and fully loved. This is unshareable. And so that can be the kind of thing that eats away. It doesn't mean that there's always a secret, that there's no one explanation, but maybe at its simplest root is a loss of hope.
Yeah. Shame and hopelessness are the two words that I'm hearing you share, and I feel like those are such helpful categories to think in, because I feel like most people I know who lose a loved one to suicide will regularly say, they're like, I never saw it coming. I don't know how this happened. Like, I know that they seemed down, but they didn't think that it would go there. And some people really seemed like they had everything together. And so it's helpful to have those categories.
Yeah, the secret part of that. It's funny because like when you say something like that, right? Like I haven't put the one and one together, but as soon as you say it, it's like, oh, holy cow, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, because there's nothing like a secret to haunt you. I mean, if you've got a friend who just says, man, I really admire and appreciate you. If I've got something that I just don't feel like I can share, the immediate whisper in the back of my head is, yeah, but would you if you knew? Again, I don't want to reduce self-harm to secret. There can be other forms of lack of hope, chronic pain, singleness, whatever it may be that's just most important. If somebody struggles with a mental health challenge and they just feel like it's not going to change, there can be any number of things that just start to sit on us and feel heavy, and we don't feel like it's going to ever relent.
And even external shame that's not hidden or secretive. I think we hear those stories more and more of teens especially who have been shamed through social media, shamed through other things, and all of a sudden they're just so overcome with it, which kind of brings me to a second question we wanted to ask you. I imagine that you've seen the CDC statistics regarding teen suicide, teen and young adult suicide, and just how remarkable there's been an increase over the past decade. So I have the statistics here that says for those aged 10 to 24, according to the CDC, there's been nearly a 60% increase in suicide from 2007 to 2018. And obviously, I think we know that rate has increased more since the pandemic, and yet we know that it's not just the pandemic, because there wasn't a pandemic happening from 2007 to 2018. That can't be the primary cause of the rise of teen suicide. So in your understanding, like in an expert's understanding, what is causing that rise?
And I think whenever we talk about statistics, statistics are wonderful, they're helpful. What we realize is that statistics talk to us about a population. They don't necessarily explain an individual.
Yeah.
And so when somebody's hurting, statistics can tell us the kinds of things that may be helpful to ask about. They don't tell us this person in front of us, their story. I think another vantage point as we're walking into this question here is how we think about crises and social trends. Something that's been helpful for me is, I think it's kind of a modern proverb, crises don't create social trends, they accelerate them. And so whatever those things are that were happening, I think you said from like 2017 to 2018, you know, there was an increase there. There was something that was happening. And if we've seen a spike in that during the COVID restrictions and the lack of socialization that's there, what happened is that caught on the current of that, and it accelerated it. And I think a few things that we see there is, one is just isolation. We live in a day of increasingly polished image, where the distance between the you that you show everybody and the you that you look at in the mirror, that you hear echoing in your own head, it gets further and further apart. The you that you see of other people, right? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, that aspect of authenticity, that ability to be comfortable with our own weaknesses, we are becoming increasingly less skilled and less okay with that. And so it means even when I have friends, how much I feel like those friends know me is decreasing unless I buck against the trends of modern social relationships. And if we're going to talk about that kind of isolation, well, yes, COVID has radically increased that kind of, or isolation in general, and added new layers where authentic human contact, in-person interaction is much more of an endangered species. Doesn't mean it's not coming back, but it's been much less frequent. So you've got isolation as a factor. You have pessimism. You know, we talk about hope being a primary factor in self-harm. You know, pessimism is kind of the antithesis of hope. And you take COVID, you take election season, you take whether we should be wearing masks, whether, you know, all of these factors where there's rancor, there's argument. Is there any sense that we're ever going to get along in a more meaningful way? 2020 was not great for that. And so you take those kinds of factors, you then ask, how do they play into other things? Isolation, pessimism, the kind of negativity that comes with that, they really compound any mental health struggle. All of those things can add to the weight that we feel, in a sense of wondering, are those things going to get better?
There's just so much there to unpack. And I'm really glad we have the next 3 hours to do so. One thing that I'm hearing a lot of, you know, throughout everything that you've been saying, just like all of these inroads for the gospel.
Yeah.
You know, I just keep hearing like the isolation, the hopelessness, you know, all of these opportunities for the church to be the church, you know, for us to
offer what we have and what we've been given.
Right.
Yeah.
That sense of community. But, you know, what are some of the things that come out in your experience and in your mind? Like what are some of the primary things that the church can do through all of these things to help?
Yeah, and if you could even take that and tell us, like, what should a pastor do, then what should a congregation do? So, like, what can the church do broadly, and then what should we be expecting from one another?
Yeah, good distinction.
You know, sometimes the most powerful things are the most simple. And so if we're just going to ask, what is the most powerful thing we can do? It's listen. I mean, when you talk about hopelessness, when you talk about despair, when you talk about isolation, man, nothing is better for that than getting me outside of my own head. And if there's one place that we should be able to talk about weaknesses, not just weaknesses, but failures, if there's things that like, hey, this isn't just something that happened to me, there's some things that I did, it should be a church. Now, we got to be honest enough to say churches are not always that authentic, just because that's how it should be. And then sometimes we become so polished, we lose that. And so one of the most important things we can do is listen. If we hear somebody, I mean, it can be hard to ask the question when you hear a sense of hopelessness, but broaching the question, have you thought about harming yourself? Again, some people like, all they notice is, are you going to kill yourself? And that, even that, the alarmistness in that, it almost begins to treat the person who is feeling hopeless as if they're a liability to be managed instead of a person to be heard.
Man.
That's incredibly helpful. I love that line of like, are you going to hurt yourself? Not, are you going to kill yourself? Really seeking to lessen that. And I love the challenge. It's such a simple thing, like you said, to listen. It makes me think of that old adage, how Job's friends were the greatest counselors a man could ask for 7 days until they opened their mouths. At day 7, they messed it all up because they decided to share what they thought. And so that's a good word, to listen and then to ask. Do you have anything else that you'd tell us to do?
Well, you ask from a pastoral perspective. And this, what I'm about to say, is probably hard for us pastor types. It would be good if our sermons weren't not quite as neat. Too often, our sermons come to a wonderful conclusion every 30 minutes, just like a sitcom. And somehow I don't think any of us would say this, it gives the impression that if I just think the right thoughts about what's going on, life should resolve as neatly as the teaching that I receive. And so there's times when we should let raw, honest questions just sit. The power for a congregation to hear their pastor say, I don't know. I don't know doesn't mean God doesn't know. I don't know doesn't mean God doesn't have anything to say on this. I don't know means this is hard. And even Christians get stumped. Oftentimes as pastors, when we want to address something, we want to preach the home run sermon. I mean, we think about hitting a home run one Sunday. The kind of thing that I think is more helpful. Because again, if you're going to do the one Sunday thing, you just got to hope the person who needs to be there is there that week. That what is often more helpful than one sermon in a year is 6 30-second illustrations with a comfortable next step. As we're talking about this and we see that theme of despair, and we just talk about life being hard. And life can be hard for Christians too. And hey, if that's you, here's what that next thing might be. And whatever that is in that particular pastor's church or community, because when I hear it more than once, it becomes safe. I mean, that's something, again, when I'm talking to pastors, what pastors talk about from the pulpit is what it is, the felt sense of what it's okay to struggle with in the pew. And if we don't talk about it, you're not welcome and you're not wanted here. You need to keep that to yourself. If you say what a church ought to do, well, churches come in all different shapes, sizes, and personalities. I would put an expectation that would seem too small for some churches, too big for other churches. Hey, what are the resources that would just be that next step? And to have something there that if you're like, I'm just not sure of anything else, for pastors, when they talk about self-harm, hey, mention, if you use a screen, put it up on the screen, the National Suicide Hotline. If you're talking about abuse, put up the National Domestic Abuse Hotline. It doesn't mean that, hey, we don't want to talk to you as a church. It just means sometimes that step to talking to somebody at church is a big step. And you give me a half step, you tell me that it really is okay, you're not going to try to control this whole process. It frees me up to talk a little more. That's one where if we come back from church at large to just an individual Christian, and we're like, hey, I'm not a pastor with a congregation. I'm a buddy with a friend. And my friend's hurting. And just saying, hey, it feels like things are hard and brittle enough right now. Could we just call somebody? Like, there's a hotline. I'm not sure what I need to ask. They can't do anything, but just to help us think this through, man, I'm going to be right here with you. But could we together talk with somebody that had more experience? And sometimes when you call that hotline, just having a friend there, it's like you don't have to remember anything they're saying. You can even initially kind of drive the friend, like, hey, drive the conversation. I'm here with my friend. They were talking with me. They've just gone through a divorce, or they just lost their job. Things are hard. They mentioned harming themselves. I've not had this kind of conversation. I want to be a good friend. You know this. Can you help me be a good friend? My buddy's right here. And that, use a hotline with some peer support just so that this person is not alone. And they can look at it and go, man, even if you're as clumsy as a teenager, you're fighting for me. And I appreciate that.
That's such a good note. It's such a good note to say, hey, walk alongside of the person, because I don't think that's something we often think about. We often say, okay, hey, here's a number to call, here's that, and not like, hey, I'll walk this way with you because I also don't know what to do, which you're right, is so encouraging. And I think even your word to the pastors, Justin and I are both pastors. He's the high school pastor, I'm college pastor, and so and I'm over our Mental Health Ministries, and so these really tied together well. Yeah. And I'm just thinking of what you're saying. I'm like, no, that actually fits beyond just pastors to not make things neat, because the Bible doesn't do that, right? Like, we always want to end on a high note of like, oh, look how beautiful this is, and
it's Romans 8.
Yes, let's look at the great thing. But we don't typically feel comfortable with a psalm that ends like Psalm 88, right? Darkness is my only companion. End. It's like, but what a friend we have in Jesus. It's like, no. Darkness is my only companion. Sit there. I'm uncomfortable sitting there. But it's something that I think we need to grow and be more comfortable.
I remember reading one book, and for the life of me, I can't remember it. And when you mention a book with pastors, they always want to know what the book is, but I honestly don't remember. But it was given a testimony. And the person had been through a really rough season. And I can't remember if it was pastor or friend on the backside, just ask them, what was most meaningful to you as we've walked this together? And the person said, you weren't afraid of my pain. You were willing to be with me in that hard time. And I thought that was such a beautiful compliment to that person who probably felt scared to death and awkward. Like, well, I hit it well. But it was like, you were with me well in that moment.
Like, all right, so there's so many good things there. Things that okay, these are ways we should be thinking, ways we should proactively be going. Yeah. But that does bring up what I hope is not a long list of what are the things maybe that we ought not to do. Doesn't need to, just
because that scares a lot of people.
Right, like I'm so scared of misstepping. What might I say? I don't want to say
the wrong thing. I don't want to make them commit suicide or make them hurt themselves. Like, right. There's that fear among friends, the fear even among pastors of,
sure,
what could I do that could set someone off? And we don't want to do that.
I think a lot of that it's a false fear, in that this is not an idea that you plant in somebody's head. It's not as if you ask a question and they go, oh, well, hadn't considered that, but maybe. Um, it Our comfort level talking makes a big difference. And so don't avoid something just because it's uncomfortable. This may go back to what we were saying just a moment ago, but don't rush somebody to hope. I think oftentimes as Christians, we get so excited about the destination that we microwave the journey. We do that with forgiveness. We are so excited about two people that we just don't walk that process of understanding the pain of what they went through well. When oftentimes when somebody's hurting, slow hope, patient hope is actually more nourishing than fast hope. So the metaphor is somewhat goofy that I use is if you went to an orthodontist and they said, we can fix your teeth in 6 weeks. That's not encouraging. You move my teeth, at least where my teeth were as an early teenager, that much, that fast, I'm pretty sure it's going to be painful. That kind of rushed, fast hope, it feels unrealistic. It's actually a form of minimizing. In churches, we have this instinct towards cultural commentary, and we miss the fact that whatever the experience is, that when there's a high-profile abuse case, and we culturally commentate on that particular instance, those who have abuse in their story, they hear that as how you would speak to them. If we can remember, I'm talking to the people in this room, and I want to speak for them in ways that are helpful for them, it will activate many of those good pastoral instincts that help us minister to those under our care in that moment.
Pastor Brad, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we close, we recognize there might be people who are watching this YouTube channel, they might be listening to this podcast, and they themselves might be considering ending their life. What would you say to them?
Yeah. Thank you for listening. It takes courage that when hope feels far off to listen. I want you to know you're not alone. That pain feels lonely, and pain feels awfully lonely. It, as awkward as it is, I would even say you're not wrong about life being hard. But just because you're not wrong about life being hard doesn't mean you're right about the solution you're considering. And so if you do me one favor, maybe talk to somebody. If I could just have one ask before you do anything that would harm yourself, talk to somebody who cares about you. Let them have the opportunity to show the love that they have for you. If you're isolated enough and you're like, I'm not sure who that is, I mentioned earlier the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Those are folks who care enough about moments of despair that somebody sits by that phone 24/7. They want you to call. And that's 1-800-273-8255. If you realized I just said a number and you should have had something to write with, 1-800-273-8255. I don't know that it spells anything, but take the opportunity, reach out. You are loved. You are cared for. Yes, things are hard and it is dark, but that doesn't mean that there is not hope. And so take the time, reach out.
Thank you, Pastor Brad.
Yes, thank you, sir. This has definitely been so helpful, to me. I hope to anybody watching or listening.
Yeah.
If you are somebody who is just struggling right now, like so many of us are, please take the time, talk to somebody, and if you know somebody that you're just a little concerned about, maybe share this with them. You know, like, hey, that's not like a shameless plug. That's actually like, hey, this was a really helpful conversation. Love to get your thoughts on it, kind of thing.
And we'll be sure to put the number to the suicide
Yes.
hotline in the comments section below. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you again, Pastor Brad, for being with us.
I'm always glad when churches and ministries want to engage the uncomfortable subject. Thank you for the invitation.
God bless you.
God bless you, brother.